Howdy hackers, and welcome to another episode of FairLight TV. Yeah, well, the content of the channel is rather varied and, well, to be honest, a slight overweight in material related to the C64 compared to Amiga and PC and the other platforms where we're also active. And this one is no exception to that. This will be about the C64, and it will have two topics picked up from my daily activities, stuff that I've been doing on the C64 over the last week. And my blushing and humble apologies for missing out last week. It might be that it actually even takes 2 weeks between the previous episode and this one. And I'm not saying this one is so good it was worth waiting for. But anyways, we are looking at a real life scenario of editing BASIC on the C64. And you shouldn't code BASIC on the C64. You shouldn't code BASIC at all. But if you have to, if you need to fiddle with somebody else's BASIC code, I'm showing you the good way of doing that, importing it to a PC-based editor, which will allow you to do that. The other is a run-through of file formats commonly used on the C64, and I'm also showing you my new tool, the sexy zipper. Yes. Over to coding BASIC on the C64. Ba-bam. Okay, let's have a look at how you can fiddle with BASIC. I've recently been involved in a project where I needed to do a bit of work in BASIC, and the option of like working with BASIC inside an emulator was sort of not an option for me. That's too cumbersome, and the keyboard is too... Yeah, well, it simply won't work. I would really hate to do that. So what I do is I use a program called CBM PRG Studio. I've been talking about that before, but now we will have a little look at that, how that looks sort of in practice. Over to that. So I started here with Dear Master. And I will show you the program. So I just dropped the PRG file directly into Dear Master. And if you double click on it, you would open, it will try to parse some aspect of the program the best way it could. And if it realizes that it is a basic program, it will show you the basic program. So back in the days, what I did was yeah, there is no Control A here, which you would want for selecting all of it. But so what I did before was something like this. Scroll. Well, I won't do that because it takes too long. But selecting everything and then making a copy and then entering. Let's see, CBM PRG Studio here. Starting a new project, C64 project, yalla yalla. Well, create. Oh yeah, you didn't see that. That popped up on the other screen. And then I would do a basic file, new basic project, add new file. Yeah, something like this one. And then I would paste it in like that. And as you see here, the data statements that I did, that work really well. But if we take something else, and I will go up here, like I would assume this is something. No. No. Okay, like that, copy, and then pasting them in here. The T's here are not the the same T's, because the T's you see here, they are kind of deleting the previous thing. This is a rem statement, so it doesn't really matter, but for this particular case. But here you see cursor movements, and if you don't import them as proper cursor movement, you will not get the proper cursor movement. And if you look at what happens here, if I run this, these are not cursor movements. So if you do it like that, it will not work. So we close that one. No, we don't. Seemingly, we don't. So what you do instead is import a basic file. And let's see if we have here my desktop. It should be on the desktop. It's that one. And here it imports, and here you can now see that first of all it imported the entire file. There is no kind of copying and pasting and all of that. The cursor movements you can see here. I will highlight that for you. You can see that it inserted them as control characters with the curly brackets and all of that. So now you have something that works 100%. It's imported and it's done properly. So don't do copy paste from DearMaster like I did and then spend a lot of time changing the stuff, but use the importer here. I also had a basic file that was based on relocated basic. It started on 0400 and it could import that as well. But when you press F6 for building a file, it will build it to 0800 or 0801. So if you have something that is a basic file that needs to sit somewhere else than 0801, then you need to manually change that in the post process. And I just do that with importing it into a file and then run it using Kick Assembler. So I use Kick Assembler to relocate files. Handy way of doing it. There is one thing I would like to warn you about in this, because CBM PRG Studio is doing a great job in very many aspects of manipulating a basic files. It can, when it saves, you can have it save taking away all the rem statements and compressing stuff, so it's sort of not taking more space than it should. This program, let's see, it's 35 blocks. When I had CBM PRG Studio exported, I think it became something like we can test that. So F6 is doing it, and desktop, and we call it ST2. And we move over here. Where do we have ST2 is here. So, okay, it wouldn't make that much of a difference, but at least it shaved off a block, and I didn't do anything. I just imported and saved it back. So it saved a block by just doing that. And there is one little aspect I just like to warn you about. If you have something like this, you see here line 100, and that is a rem, so it's a remark. That's inserting a comment for you who are not familiar with C64 Basic. If you make a jump, or a jump is the machine code for it, but if you make a go to or a go sub to address to line number 100, and then you have CBM PRG Studio jumping to address line 100, that means that you no longer have the line number that might be referenced. And as I know of the program, there is no reference. This became weird. There is no way to validate that all the go subs and all the go tos actually point to a valid line number, and especially if you do something well, if you optimize away the number of lines, then it's particularly important to ensure that you don't have any go-tos or go-subs to that. So what I needed to do with this one was go through it and validate that all the go-tos and go-subs were not pointing to a line number that would be optimized away. So keep that in mind. Otherwise, I would strongly encourage you to use CBM PRG Studio when you're messing with basic files, because it's doing a really good job with it. Yeah, this is Berserker Raids. Yeah, I think that was the name of the program. Some warnings for you. Ensure that you don't have any jumps, go-tos or go-subs to rem statements, and do use the proper importer. Do not copy and paste, because that will work less good. That was Fiddling with Basic in CBM PRG Studio. Thank you. The next thing I would like to discuss, that is file formats on the C64, or rather related to the C64. First of all, you have the basic formats. That would be PRG and sequential files, and they are just a stream of bytes, where a PRG is just flagging that the first 2 bytes are the load address for loading the file, and then when the DOS recognizes that it's a PRG file, it loads it, and then it stores it at the address of the 2 first bytes. Whereas a sequential file is the same, it's just that it's not flagging that the first 2 bytes has any sort of special meaning. So normally you would have stuff like word processor files and all of that as the first file. And then we have more esoteric formats. One would be user, which is basically a sequential file, but it's telling the DOS that I don't know what this is. The user has defined some sort of format for this. And then there are relative files, which nobody really understands. It's sort of a database structure where I think there is some sort of core that references other parts, but I've never worked with relative files, and there aren't that many programs that actually use them. I think Yeos is doing it, but I don't. That might be just to confuse everybody else. So these are sort of the native file formats that you can find on disks. And then you have more emulator-oriented file formats. One would be D64, which is an image of a disk. Basically a 1541 disk. So a more logical name would be D41, because it's indicating it's just a single side normal 170K disk image. There are D71s, which is the dual side disk image, and then you have a D81, which is an image of a 3.5 inch floppy disk, the 1581. So and these are like just raw copies of the DOS content, and the DOS content is on the sort of the logical layer. It's not the physical layer, but the logical layer, and then the sectors are just sitting there in a big stream, like a sequential files out of sectors, basically. If you want something, and that cannot hold any sort of error information or anything related to that, it's there are special versions of the D64s. They're not really well spread, but they have a little little table in the end indicating the errors that goes with each of the sectors. But I wouldn't recommend you to use that, because it's not really widely supported by any sort of software for it. So if you want to have a format that has a full copy of the disk that includes the any sort of errors, then you would have the G64 or the nib format, and these are what sort of nib tools and other tools that read the flux layer on the of the disk is using. G64s are really good, and there aren't that many protections that I'm aware of that couldn't be properly replicated inside a G64. Tapes, yeah, the equivalent of a D64 is a T64. That's sort of only on DOS level, where files are sitting there and there is some sort of directory what the tape is including and all of that. But basically think of a D64 and a T64 being one for disk and one for tape, basically. Tap format is sort of the equivalent of a G64. It reads on the more physical layer of what's on the tape, and all the speed loaders and all of that can work fine inside tap. I haven't seen anything that sits on a native C64 tape which couldn't be transferred into a tap file. It would be interesting to talk with somebody who are sort of dedicated to tape loaders if they have any opinion on that, but yeah, let's not do this time. I will probably have an interview with somebody who is sort of keen on tape loaders, and if we can have a discussion on tap and how it works. And then we have additional formats which are sort of native formats to the C64 platform, but which can also work sort of outside. And the first one would be links. Think of that as, I think the Unix command is tar. That it joins the files into one big file. So if you want to send a multi-file program over a modem, you want to ensure that people don't kind of lose one or two of the files, because that would be a disaster, and then the program wouldn't run. So you want to join them in some sort of container so that you can transfer it and all files will be there. So links is a great format for that. It has some pros and cons. First is that it's quite neatly structured. So what it does, it takes every file on the C64 on a disk has a link to the next sector, to the next sector, to the next sector. And then the last sector indicates that, okay, now we have these many bytes used in this last sector. So what links is doing, it's taking that last link and then pointing it to the next file. So it becomes one big chain of all the sectors inside the links file. And then it adds a little header to the beginning of the links file, one which is something that actually runs in BASIC that says you need some sort of links program to dissolve this. And then there is a directory that keeps track of all the places where it's made the changes to the end of the file. So when you load it from anywhere to a disk and dissolve it, all the dissolver needs to do is get rid of the header and then replace the end markers of all the sort of the segments inside this big file, and then replace the directory. So replacing the directory and fixing all the ends, and suddenly the file is there. You never needed to copy anything around because the sectors are all there, and it's a minimal number of operations you need to do on the disk to dissolve a links file. Very, very handy. I always sort of liked links. It has a number of drawbacks. I don't think you can have deleted files, so you can't have like directory art or anything like that. For me, that's sort of the only real drawback that has made sense to me. Peter Schaefer has done a lot of documentation, and he was the original author of the program called 64 Copy. And that one, then he needed to copy back and forth between outside and inside of a links directory or of a links file. And you typically need to recreate the entire links file because it's very difficult to just insert and delete stuff from a links file. That's sort of the drawback, but it's only apparent for those writing support tools for links. If you have the tool and you want to pack things into something and then you can send it off, then links is for sure a good format for that. The entire ambition of my talk is getting to this last thing. It's zip disk. So zip is a rather well used word in the context of computers. It means so many things. You have zip, which is the compression, archiving and compression on PC. Zip disk has nothing to do with that. Then there is something called zip file on the 64, which is sort of doing stuff for files. I haven't looked into this, but this is zip disk. So the idea with zip disk is to take an entire disk and then chunk it into 4 segments, and you can see it on BBSs, because when you want to send a full disk over a BBS, zip disk is typically the format that is sort of encouraged. You are encouraged to use. So you would have 1 exclamation mark, 2 exclamation mark, 3 exclamation mark, 4 exclamation mark. That are the 4 files that is the result, or they are the result of running a zip disk program. Zip disk has a number of features. So when it sees that a full sector is full of the same byte, typically zeros, it has a special way of marking that inside the output. So that means that unused sector, or sectors filled with 0, they are basically represented with, I think it's 4 bytes, track sector. No, it's even 3 bytes. It's track sector and then the byte. Track uses a flag on the track byte to indicate that this is a compressed sector. So it would just know that from now on you have 256 zeros that should be put in the output. Very convenient. That saves a lot of room, and that is the major improvement over just kind of splitting the disk into 4, because then you would have a file which is more than 170K. But why use this in the first place? Yeah, because if you're running a BBS, you need to be able to have something which can hold the disk image. And if you send a D64 to a BBS, they might store it on a hard disk, but when you download it, you need to be able to store the files on normal floppy disk. And because a disk image is always bigger than the actual disk, there needs to be some sort of mechanism of splitting that into smaller files, so you can spread them across disks or pack them so it fits on one physical disk, and then you can manage them afterwards. This all sector is the same byte. That's one of the features. It also has a run length encoding function. That means that if you have repeated bytes, you can mark that as a track, and then the depacker can decompress those long sequences of the same byte into something which is represented in fewer bytes. That's also shrinking the output file. In general, I would say that is less of a saving than the all bytes are the same, especially when everything is packed with Exomizer and all of that. A normal scene release doesn't contain very much that could be RLE compressed any further. So yeah, if you're implementing a zip disk in something you're doing, if you're just doing the packer part, I don't think you basically need to implement the RLE part unless you really want to. If you're making the depacker, then you have to do it, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to support all potential incoming files. If they were created using one of the native tools, they are for sure supporting the RLE option. Yeah, so I would want to just do this. Now you saw my my little script here, because I've actually done a zip disk encoder. So what I do here is sexy zipper, and I send the parameter dummy D64 and then destination. That is the name part of the file. So it's not, you cannot give like a destination directory or anything like that. We should possibly do this first so you see what we have here. Yes, sorry, I should have deleted that. Right. And now I run it, and you see I am now generating the files. Ta-dam! So that was sexy zipper and an expose on file formats on the C64. That was everything for this week. The two topics we have been able to go through today were ones picked from the activity I've done on the C64 over the last few weeks. So both the coding of this zip disk tool, and also fiddling with BASIC and managing the Berserker Raids games, which had parts in BASIC, were stuff that I've been doing over the last week or so. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're subscribing to the channel, and I also hope I will be able to welcome you next week to FairLight TV. Bye bye.